It's great to see everyone. It's great to see different people coming in today for the day. So thanks for all of your support. I'm Rusty Greiff, Chief Strategy and Growth Officer for JFF. Very, very excited for this conversation. A tremendous group of some dear friends here on this and new friends on the panel. I especially want to call out and thank 2U for their support all day and a kind of evolving partnership that we're having at JFF and 2U, and thanks for their support specifically for the panel. This is a particularly exciting conversation, not just for me, but I think what we're seeing, especially in the last week here at South by EDU. We have 3 innovators and pioneers that are helping shape this new learning marketplace that's focused on innovation, on how we learn and how we work and how we train across a whole new level of regional and national digital platforms that are truly leveraging what has been kind of past assets, if you will, and past resources that are levered around institutional universities, around technology, community-based learning, and education, and looking at the role that impact employers and corporations are playing in this new lifelong learning marketplace. Maria and Scott started off the day talking about innovations, bold move, disruptions. At JFF, we focus a lot on dual transformation. So we look at changes that we can make, transformational changes we can make in existing systems at the state level, at the community level, with regional economies, and certainly with university corporations and other stakeholders in the place. The 3 people here that I'll introduce are doing exactly that. They're taking kind of past systems and really innovating and pushing them in new ways. We'd like to think that this is going to be, candidly, a 10 to 15 year, if not 20 to 50, to 50 year endeavor that we're on, and that's exactly why we feel like there's a lot of urgency and a momentum to drive new innovations, a new agency, if you will, around this work, very much focused on equity and focused on access. So what we're trying to do today is demystify a little bit, if you can, and we're going to have David, Molly, and Antonio talk about what's working now. It's literally like the future has already arrived. How do we take, to some degree, the innovations that they're doing across the corporate sector, across the university sector, working with Latinos, and how do we take that in new ways and really build on it in scale? Some quick context. We've talked a little bit about some of these themes today. 90 million adult workers are in need of reskilling or upskilling. 64 million do not have post-secondary degrees. We're seeing community college enrollment drop significantly. We're seeing student debt rise. You're looking at unemployment. Black workers have 2 times unemployment than white workers over the last 50 years. And in a study that a colleague, Michael Collins, did that we've talked about a couple of times that looks the work that he's leading in racial economic equity, called out a stunning number of around $96 billion difference in the pay gap between black and white learners right now. And so there's real systemic issues that we're confronting even in the innovation space. And I actually want to start with David, have him introduce himself and share where he is at 2U and the work he's doing. But there's 2 or 3 big, bold initiatives that you guys are leading right now that are addressing issues of equity and access that literally have just been kind of formed in the last 2 to 3 years, I think are kind of exciting as models for us to think about as multi-stakeholder partnership. Love for you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
Great, thanks Rusty. Good afternoon and morning to everybody. David Sutphen, Chief Strategy and Engagement Officer at 2U. edX, for those of you who aren't familiar with 2U and edX, we are now the largest provider of what we describe as kind of free-to-degree offerings in partnership with great universities around the world. So everything from Yale physician assistant degree to a massive open online course on innovation, and we have boot camps in 8 different technical skills areas, a whole portfolio of executive education courses like Yale Women's Leadership, and some exciting new undergraduate online initiatives. And that's actually one of the things that I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about. I have the good fortune, maybe about a decade ago, of getting to know President Thomas, who's now the president of Morehouse, who at the time was a professor at Harvard Business School. And for those of you who are familiar with the online education space, historically, some schools, HBCUs in particular, but a lot of private nonprofits have not played in the online undergrad space. So about a year and a half ago, in the middle of COVID, we started talking to President Thomas about their kind of Morehouse Without Borders vision. So as Rusty was talking about, there are 36 million Americans in the United States who've stopped out of college, and of those, 3 million are Black. And when you talk about the disparities in income and opportunity, Black men in particular struggle a lot and the most with those disparities. And so, as we started to talk to President Thomas about his vision, he's like, the world needs more of Morehouse now. And so last year we entered into a partnership with Morehouse, where Morehouse is now offering an undergraduate degree completion offering fully online, supported by 2U. Morehouse controls the admissions criteria and the faculty and the curriculum. And just to give you a sense, the first cohort, there were about 250 Black men who enrolled in the program, average age 36. About 25% of those were men who had actually started at Morehouse earlier in their lives and stopped out. And you will see us do more of these partnerships, but when you think about the power of partnership, and I interviewed President Thomas last year at ASU GSV and asked him pointedly, why wouldn't Morehouse do this on its own? And I think his answer was, pretty profound in the sense that, to Rusty's point about this is a 5, 10, 15, 20-year transformation, and his view was Morehouse doesn't have 5 to 10 years to wait. We need to get into the game now, because if we wait 5 to 10 years, we will miss the window of opportunity. And so very excited about that work. The other thing that I'll spend a couple minutes about, and interestingly, one of the partnerships that Molly and 2U and edX share is Guild. So our Morehouse offering is now going to be something that PepsiCo's employees will be able to take advantage of. So that's exciting. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about are, as I mentioned, we have a bunch of coding, tech skills-based boot camps, UX, UI, cyber, fintech, and we partner now with over 40 public and private nonprofit universities around the country. And a couple of years ago, we started to experiment with public-private partnerships with local workforce boards around the country, where funding for the slots in the boot camps would be covered by 2U, helping to discount the cost of the offerings, as well as local workforce boards and employers. And I'm excited to say we now have 5 of these partnerships around the United States. And what's great about them is one of the things that we offer the university partners who we work with on the boot camp side and the students who go through those programs is we provide free career supports and placement. So if you hire out of our boot camps as an employer, it's free. And so this year we'll do 30,000 employer referrals out of these boot camps. And so what's great is we now have a mechanism to serve historically or traditionally underrepresented communities in the tech field. And they're able to go to these boot camps either for free or very low cost. And then employers in those regions are able to recruit them out of the boot camps, and we provide all of the supports. And later this year, we'll be coming out with some interesting research from Gallup on the boot camps. And I think these questions of how boot camps, if they are high quality, can create kind of more equitable pathways. And I know Antonio will probably talk a little bit about some of the exciting work he's been doing over the years on boot camps as a training opportunity. So with that, I will I'll stop because I
can I just follow up on something?
Sure.
Again, kind of the theme that we want to unpack on this panel is just the power of these complex partnership models where you have diversified stakeholders that bring assets, resources, and especially their own distribution channels, if you will, or community channels for Black and Latinx workers and learners. What you just described sounds pretty complicated. And I'm just curious, David, what were the 1 or 2 things that kind of learning from a best practice of that experience, and how do you see that model as being one that can be replicated? And because we always talk about, at JFF in particular, how do we get to scale, right? How do we use a model and drive that into scale? And so I'm just curious what you saw as maybe the biggest obstacle and opportunity to take what you've done and bring it to even more scalable place?
So, and I'll try and answer that question quickly. So I am a big believer in the power of what I would describe as kind of tri-sector athletes. So individuals who understand how to operate and translate across kind of civil society, the public sector, and the private sector. And in order to make these partnerships work, you need folks who can do that effectively, because the incentive structures in all of these different entities are very different. And if people don't understand the language and the ability to find and structure relationships where people are playing to their strengths and the things that those institutions need in order to kind of be in it for the long term are met, they're never going to work. And so I think one of the things that I believe we need a more open and honest dialogue about in this discussion, and I'm on a bunch of nonprofit boards. I chair the board of Get Schooled, I'm on the City Bridge Foundation board, I'm on the Teaching Strategies board. So I get to see the K through higher ed spectrum across all of this, and my sense is the marketplace and what's going on in the world right now is 3 to 5 years ahead of where the policy discussion is. And I think that there's a lot that could be happening with the help of governments at the federal, state, and local level to incentivize and create mechanisms for these kinds of partnerships. Because I worked for Senator Kennedy for many, many years, and he used to always say, the hard stuff's already been solved. So the reason why this stuff is so difficult is because there aren't easy answers, and there's no one dimension of those 3 points of the triangle who is going to solve this problem. And so people need to kind of get over the preciousness of the fact that it's going to get solved just by government or by civil society or by the business community. And we need to be creating mechanisms and conversations and partnerships, some of which will fail, that enable all of those stakeholders to come together and solve these problems.
Great. I appreciate that. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Molly, so Molly's Chief Learning Officer of PepsiCo. I was doing some research on Pepsi and PepsiCo before this conversation. I want to make sure I get this right. And you guys, PepsiCo products are enjoyed by consumers more than 1 billion times a day in more than 200 countries.
It's staggering, isn't it?
That totally blew me away. Exactly. I thought that was so I thought that was fascinating. But one of the things that we're seeing, kind of piggybacking a little bit on building on David's point around like where there are pockets of innovation and where there could be opportunities for true impact and scale. And Kat Ward at JFF, my colleague, does a lot of work and really leading work around impact employers, and certainly PepsiCo is one of them, is the new role, if you will, or an evolving and refined role that large-scale corporations and even smaller businesses are taking to become learning and training institutions. And I'd love to get a better sense on kind of how you're looking at that strategically, and a couple of interesting things you guys have done just since you've come on board, which has not been that long at PepsiCo, where you're really pushing the agenda of the role that an impact employer needs to play, moving off of what David is looking at and some of Antonio's work at the community level, at the regional economic level, and with actual learning institutions themselves. So share a little bit more of how you're approaching that work.
Absolutely. So yes, I'm Molly Nagler. I joined PepsiCo 3 years ago as Chief Learning Officer, and before that I was Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at Yale School of Management. So David, it warms my heart to hear you talk about Yale's Women's Leadership Program. So I've been on both sides of the aisle. And at PepsiCo, David was talking about these complex ecosystems of stakeholders, and we certainly see that at PepsiCo. We have the PepsiCo Foundation that engages with communities and does some educational efforts there. And to date, we haven't linked them up yet with the learning that's happening internally for our own employees. So I see that as a really important next frontier to have a strategic overlay over all of those things. But for our own employees, and we do have 290,000 employees all over the world, we just launched a few weeks ago in the US access to 100 plus debt-free certificates, degrees, high school completion, English language learning, college prep for our US employees. So it's over 100,000 employees who will have access to this. And again, it's no cost up front, it's completely paid by the company, and it's in areas that are linked to the business needs at PepsiCo. So we want people to feel like they're making an investment in an area that will help their career if they want to stay at the company. But our CHRO actually talks a lot about employability in general and being able to take steps outside the company if that's what's right. And I see employers getting a lot more comfortable with that, about educating for lifelong learning and not necessarily, direct employment at the company, or just having options there. So that's a really big and exciting initiative, and we're seeing a lot of uptake there. We're also doing more to democratize access to learning beyond that. So in our live cohort-based programs that we moved entirely to Zoom, during COVID, we've doubled the number of programs that don't require you to be nominated by your supervisor. And that was just really getting in the way of people's access to these programs like First Time Manager and Coaching Manager and career milestone things. And so we've seen a huge uptick in enrollments and the scale that online learning enables. So we're seeing, and I think this is true to you as a player here, is like we've been in the era of the end of the gatekeeper for a really long time now. And I think, companies need to think themselves about how are we gatekeeping internally in ways that are unnecessary. And so in the program that we launched with Guild, which is the access to the 100+ certificates and degrees, you don't need manager approval. Your manager is notified so that person can support you, but it doesn't require approval. It's much more like, healthcare benefits at a company. So I think that's a really important step forward. There's lots of other things we do internally. We have a learner experience platform where you can get bite-sized learning on demand on any device, anytime, anywhere. Again, just more access there. So I think it's important for employers more and more going forward to think not just about what they're adding in terms of opportunities for people to learn, but what they're taking away and barriers to learning. And time is a huge one. It's a huge one for all of us everywhere in our lives. There's so many distractions and commitments that we have. And we're experimenting in our Latin America business with meeting-free Wednesdays. And no one's saying you have to use your meeting-free Wednesday to learn. But when you look at data for usage of our learner experience platform, you see it go up quite a bit when people have some free time. And so that's really instructive. And so again, to the point of scale, like how do we get that policy or a similar policy implemented elsewhere in the company? There's a lot of joy in learning, and I think people want to do it, and they just need to have the opportunity.
I'm just, I know we're supposed to always prep for these with questions that we've already choreographed on the web. I'm going to throw one to Molly that we've not talked about before. Sorry, I just had to do it. But David, you touch on transformation and disruption, which 2U has done for the last 10+ years with the American university and institution, and that's a model that requires an extraordinary amount of rigor and imagination to reimagine and disrupt the learning institution. In a similar vein, looking at an entity that has 290,000 students, workers, learners, dreamers, and believers in their career and their lives, I'm just curious what it's like to be the chief learning officer of that kind of community. And I'm just curious the challenges that you face, Molly, on some of the initiatives that you've brought in over the last 2.5 years to work on innovation, to create, to remove those barriers of learning and training, because that's pretty extraordinary and it's got to be really, really difficult. And as we think about the pieces for scale, those are scalable platforms at 290,000 students and and workers. I'm just curious what that process has been like for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolute joy to have that playground, right, of learners. And the challenges are, even as I think as learning professionals, to switch our routines and habits and move away from a nomination-based process to an open access process. And it took COVID, to jolt us out of that routine, and it's been wonderful. So I think really questioning the status quo of how things have been done, and what would it take? Ask yourself questions like, what would it take to have everyone in the company, learning at least one program a quarter, right? Or learning in the flow of work. What would it take? And so thinking about it like that. Again, this time, I found that even with a learner experience platform with little 30-second, 5-minute videos, podcasts, like at some point you can't get it short enough. Mm-hmm. So there's diminishing marginal returns to keeping cutting this stuff down, and then you have to think about giving people the time.
Right. It's great.
Yeah.
I'm excited to give Antonio space in the work that he's led for years. I'll let him introduce himself and the work that the Hispanic Heritage Foundation does. But one of the things that we've identified at JFF is just an important piece of the equation, obviously, in looking at the continuum of learning and training and lifelong learning is navigation, career and learning navigation, and the ability to make sense, if you will, in a pretty disoriented marketplace. And one of the things that I've been really impressed with how you guys have built is resources and assets to begin career navigation at different levels and stages for primarily Latino workers and learners and where they are through their own journey. And I'd love you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit more of the work that you guys done, which is significant across a lot of different areas, but also specifically the LOFT program that I think has been really powerful from a navigation and lifelong learning platform standpoint.
No, thank you for that. So I'm Antonio Tijerino with the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, and I'm thrilled to be on a panel with the two of you, and David, who's been a friend for a very long time, and new friends. But we felt a sense of urgency. And I think that's something that I would instill in anyone that's doing this kind of work, is that we need to be more impatient with that work that we're doing. When everybody talks about the future of work, it's a misnomer. Right now, over the next decade, almost 80% of all new jobs will be taken by a Latino. So this is something that we need to figure out right now in terms of making sure that America can move forward as the Latino community moves forward. So we started a program, just as an example. I mean, two of the legs of the table that our programs sit on are education and workforce development. So we saw that nobody was really in the space of teaching Latinos how to code. So we created a program called Code as a Second Language. It was done as a pilot. We were somewhere in East LA. We are very fortunate that people from Google's Employee Resource Group, which is the importance of employee resource groups, volunteered. And they took the program and supported it across 10 markets. So it went from an hour-long jam session in East LA to being in 10 markets. And Hector Mujica was on here earlier from google.org, and I can tell you that his commitment has made sure that we're now teaching 100,000 kids how to code. The important part is, where do you go from there? So those hour-long jam sessions turned into boot camps, then turned into actual academies across years. But we need that content in order to teach that, and that's where To You and others come in. We also need the mentoring programs that are a part of it. Tutoring is the next thing that we're looking at doing, because I can tell you as a parent whose kids have to use tutors, it is very expensive, and you even have to identify that need is there. So the other part of it is, what is the whole cycle? What is the arc of the story that you're trying to tell? And a lot of times, the easiest part to do is to teach a child how to code. It's important, but where does it end? And we're actually placing thousands into jobs with Fortune 100 companies, with government agencies, because we've built this ecosystem that keeps being used across the different area, but also through the Loft Institute that we raised up over the last couple of years. And one of those categories is tech, another one's education, sustainability, social justice. We have engineering, all the different areas that you would imagine are priorities for our workforce. Social capital is very, very critical in doing this kind of work. You want to make sure, the same way David and I have been friends for almost 25 years, you want to make sure that you're building that when somebody is 17 years old in a very particular industry, because we don't necessarily have an uncle or an aunt that plays golf with somebody at Goldman that then can give us advice in the financial sector or in the fintech area. We also want to we have to be very adaptable in the work you do. And so one of the things that we've been able to do is, for instance, one of our board members was the chief blockchain officer for PayPal. And he was somebody within our network. And so he came up to us and said, listen, we have to go into different directions. You have an amazing network we have over 300,000 vetted Latinos that have gone through our programs. But where do they go from there? What are those options that they have in terms of the future of work? So we were able to do something called Hacking Careers in FinTech or in other areas, and with great success. But it really is dependent on every piece of that pipeline, not just the beginning, which is the easiest to measure.
We don't have a huge amount of time, but I want to build on that. And the area around social mobility and networks is a huge area that JFF is investing in as well, and looking at what does that mean in building community over the lifetime, and lifelong learning in the marketplace itself is very relevant to that. So I'd love to just go around. I'm going to start with Antonio. If we're realizing this imagination of what truly this more dynamic learning marketplace needs to be, and what that looks like, as I started off talking about 15 to 20 years, and each one of you brought in some very specific characteristics, I think, that kind of fuels this engine of the marketplace, that may be nonlinear learning, that is around lifelong learning. I'd love to, for each of you, if you guys don't mind going around, what needs to be true? It could be one or a couple of things that you believe over the next 5 to 10 years that needs to be true to realize the work that you guys are doing, but in a way that is even more integrated, that even has more scalable characteristics, and is actually creating some more opportunities to drive equity and access, primarily for Black and Latinx learners, but all those that are underserved. I'm just curious if there's one or two things that need to be done. David touched a little bit from a legislative and policy standpoint, feeling that they are coming around, but it's around the corner of the innovations that all three of you are doing. Anything on your end, Antonio, that you think needs to happen in the next couple of years?
For us, one of the areas that we're trying to also tackle is access to Wi-Fi and technology and devices in order to have equity in learning. I mean, you can be 5 years old and already be not on the same playing field as other children. And it's a real issue in our community, especially when you're Latino in a rural area or along border towns. So I think that's one area that we can't lose sight as we're talking about equity. I think also collaboration. We need to be more collaborative. What Molly's doing at PepsiCo is key, that follows what David's been doing. And this is an example. And I'm at the earlier end of it. How are we teaching 100,000 youth how to code? Where do they go from there? What are the runways, additional runways that they need to develop in order to get into APCS courses? And then where do you go from there in terms of mentoring, in terms of some of the other areas, building social capital within these industries, which is very important. It's not just simply that somebody takes you out for pizza once a month and says they're your mentor. No, if it's in a particular space that you're trying to go into this area, and that's the importance of employee resource groups, I just want to mention again, with big companies and going out into the community and building the connectivity in a really authentic way that's ultimately going to help the company and the industry.
Thanks, Antonio.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, at PepsiCo, we have something called PepsiCo Positive, which is a really multifaceted transformational approach where we're thinking about climate change, sustainability, investments in our suppliers and supply chain and human capital. So it's a very holistic approach, and will definitely involve more partnerships like you're talking about. I want to build on what Tony said, and I think what needs to happen is that we take a life cycle approach here. And I think the risk is that we all optimize within our span of control, and then the links that are so vital across don't work. I mean, so what that would look like for me would be like, I just keep creating all these amazing programs, and then no one's thinking about what the next job is, right? Because like that's outside of learning, right? So it's talent acquisition, working with inside a company, learning, working with talent management, working with in our case the PepsiCo Foundation to make sure that all of these different initiatives are connected and add up to something meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is one of the other partnerships that we launched last year, which has I think been pretty compelling, is a partnership among Netflix, Norfolk State, and 2U and our boot camps. And I was interviewing the president of Norfolk State, and one of the things that she said I thought was really profound, which is she said, not every student in Norfolk who enrolls in one of these Netflix boot camps is going to succeed. And I think one of the problems with our system right now is the cost of failure is too high, right? It either puts you too far in debt or it narrows the pathways that you think are possible. So I think at a macro level, one of the things we have to figure out is how do we enable people to get exposed to more things and have the risk proposition of failure not be so devastating? Because we're all fooling ourselves if people are going to fail, whether that's because they pick a subject that, they don't love or they don't have an aptitude for, or just because they just aren't in it to win it. And so one of the things that I'm excited about now with 2U and edX coming together is, for the longest time, the only option that you had was, at least in the portfolio of things that we were doing with universities, was to go get a full-fledged degree, right? And whereas now with things like micro bachelors and micro masters and open courses, you can go experiment and see if you have a passion for or interest in a particular subject, and do it in a way that does not, load you up with a ton of debt. And then you can figure out, I think, to Molly's point, different kind of career trajectory. So I think the other thing that we need is much, much better career navigation guidance mechanisms, whether those are tech-enabled or people-enabled, where if you wake up one day and you say, you know what, I want to do something different, who's there to help you discern the choices, the implications of those choices, the costs of those choices, and what's on the other end of, the rainbow, so to speak, to enable people to make better, more informed decisions about whatever the path is that they want to be on.
Rusty, can I add to
sure,
that?
of course.
I love that point about the cost of failure being too high, and something that a lot of companies are doing that we're going to do at PepsiCo very soon is launch a talent marketplace where there's people can work on projects at scale, meaning that if I need something done on a project, it used to be that I would just call my network. Now they'll all be posted in this marketplace, and so if somebody wants to try out, finance, they can go apply their transferable skills to a finance project, and then it ends, right? And then they can decide if they want that job or not. And it really lowers the stakes, and it gives people that exposure. I think that's so important when you're trying out new things.
I would just want to say thank you. It's far too short a time, and I know we could spend a lot of time talking more about these more innovative models, but I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing and how you guys are disrupting really complex marketplaces and systems. So just to thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity for us to get together. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.